Talking about the hate Bonnie gets in the Toy Story fandom sounds exaggerated, until you go online and realize just how many people genuinely blame her for Woody's fate. From memes to full video essays, Bonnie went from being the sweet little girl who saved the toys at the end of Toy Story 3 to becoming one of the most disliked characters in the entire franchise. And the strange part is, Bonnie was never a villain. She never destroyed toys like Sid Phillips. She never emotionally manipulated people the way Lotsa Huggin' Bear did. She was never intentionally cruel. And yet, a huge part of the fandom ended up seeing her as selfish, ungrateful, and somehow responsible for ruining the perfect ending to Toy Story. But to understand why Bonnie gets so much backlash, you have to look at something deeper. The hatred toward Bonnie didn't really start because of what she did. It started because of what the franchise emotionally built around Andy over the course of 3 movies. Andy wasn't just the toy's owner, he represented an idealized version of childhood. He was imaginative, loving, and deeply emotionally connected to his toys. Even when someone new like Buzz Lightyear showed up, Woody never stopped feeling important to him. Throughout the series, we watched Andy grow up, change, and mature, while still holding onto that emotional bond with his toys. And the audience grew up alongside him. Toy Story was never just about toys going on adventures. It was also about the fear of growing up and leaving an important part of your life behind. That's why Toy Story 3 hit an entire generation so hard emotionally. Andy's goodbye wasn't seen as the ending of a kid's movie. It felt like the end of a personal chapter for the people who grew up with these films. And that's where Bonnie comes in. A lot of people forget how she was actually introduced in Toy Story 3. Because Bonnie didn't arrive as a threat to Woody or as someone who would destroy Andy's legacy. Quite the opposite. Bonnie represented hope. After escaping Sunnyside, Woody accidentally ends up in Bonnie's room, and for the first time in a long while, he feels safe again. The scene is clearly designed to communicate that feeling. Bonnie plays creatively, gives every toy a voice, invents stories, and treats each one like an important part of her adventures. After everything the toys had gone through, especially their fear of being abandoned, Bonnie's room felt safe. And that matters deeply to Woody, because he genuinely believes he's found another child capable of loving them the way Andy once did. That's why the ending of Toy Story 3 worked so well emotionally. Andy wasn't just leaving his toys anywhere, he was leaving them with someone who seemed to share the same imagination and affection he had as a child. For years, a lot of people considered that ending perfect. Then Toy Story 4 came out, and with it came the beginning of the massive backlash against Bonnie. The 4th movie does something the fandom was never emotionally prepared to accept. Woody stops being important to Bonnie. Right from the beginning of the film, it's obvious that Woody no longer has a special place in her games. Jessie becomes more important to her, while Woody spends most of his time sitting forgotten in the closet. For many viewers, that felt like a direct betrayal of everything Toy Story had built emotionally. The internet reacted immediately. People started calling Bonnie a bad owner, saying she didn't deserve Woody, and arguing that Andy would have never treated his toys that way. But this is where the uncomfortable truth comes in. Bonnie was acting like a real child. And that's probably the real issue at the center of this entire debate. The audience wanted Bonnie to preserve the emotional fantasy that had been built around Andy. They wanted Woody to stay special forever. But kids change. Kids develop new interests. Kids outgrow toys. And Toy Story 4 decided to portray that reality in a much more honest way. Forky is the perfect example of that. A lot of fans hated the fact that Bonnie became attached to a homemade spork instead of Woody, but within a child's mindset, it actually makes complete sense. Forky is created during an emotionally important moment in Bonnie's life. She's entering a new stage at school, and she accidentally creates an object that becomes a source of emotional comfort. The problem is that the audience didn't see Forky the way Bonnie did. The audience saw Woody being replaced, and that triggered one of the biggest fears running through the entire franchise: the fear of no longer mattering. Toy Story has always been about that. Woody feared being replaced by Buzz. Jessie feared being abandoned again. Lotso was emotionally destroyed after feeling forgotten. And Toy Story 4 pushes that fear further than ever when Woody realizes he no longer holds the same place in Bonnie's life. But instead of blaming the narrative itself, a huge part of the fandom chose to blame Bonnie directly. because emotionally, that was easier. A lot of people felt Woody had already suffered too much to end up ignored in a closet. After 4 movies where he literally risks his life for his friends and his owners, watching Bonnie barely acknowledge him felt cruel. But Toy Story 4 never frames Bonnie as a villain. The movie never tries to portray her as malicious. Bonnie is still sweet, creative, and emotional. The reality is simply that Woody no longer fits into this stage of her life. And that's where the movie makes a surprisingly mature choice. Because the conflict is no longer about one toy being replaced by a newer toy, like what happened with Buzz. Now the conflict is about something unavoidable. Children grow up, and their interests change. That generational shift is a huge part of why Bonnie ended up being so heavily rejected. Andy represents a version of childhood that was deeply tied to physical imagination. His generation still relied heavily on toys as their main source of entertainment. Bonnie represents a different kind of childhood, and that's going to become even more noticeable in Toy Story 5. While official details about the movie are still limited, Pixar Animation Studios has already confirmed that the story will explore the relationship between traditional toys and modern technology. Promotional material even shows children paying more attention to electronic devices than to the toys themselves. That completely changes the context of the franchise. Because now, the issue isn't just Woody feeling forgotten anymore. Now the toys are facing something much bigger. A generation that finds entertainment in completely different ways. And that makes Bonnie's character even more interesting. For years, a lot of people interpreted her behavior as individual selfishness, when in reality, Bonnie works more as a symbol of generational change. She didn't stop playing with Woody because she was cruel. She stopped playing with Woody because real kids do that. There's also something fascinating about the way audiences view the character. As the years go by, Andy becomes more and more idealized. People remember only his best moments and forget that he also left toys untouched for long periods of time. Woody himself spent a lot of time sitting on a shelf in Toy Story 2. Bo Peep disappeared before Toy Story 3, and Andy barely ever mentioned her again. But because audiences grew emotionally attached to Andy, those moments are almost never judged as harshly. With Bonnie, it's the exact opposite. Every time she stops paying attention to Woody, the fandom treats it like a personal betrayal, because Woody is no longer just a toy inside the story. Woody represents the childhood of millions of people. That's why so many viewers don't analyze Bonnie as a realistic child character, but as someone who failed to appreciate something the audience sees as emotionally sacred. And that creates an impossible comparison. Because Bonnie was never going to compete with the nostalgia attached to Andy. Andy was the kid an entire generation grew up with. Bonnie was the little girl who came after the perfect ending. The moment Toy Story 3 ended, Bonnie was already carrying enormous expectations on her shoulders. To audiences, she wasn't just a new owner for the toys. She was responsible for continuing the emotional legacy Andy left behind. But Toy Story 4 shatters that fantasy almost immediately. Woody stops being a priority. Bonnie starts focusing on other toys. And for the first time, the franchise shows something much closer to real childhood. Even the toys we love the most can eventually be left behind. That change alone was enough for a huge part of the fandom to start seeing Bonnie as some kind of emotional traitor within the franchise. Not because she actually did something monstrous, but because she appeared right after the most nostalgic and emotional moment in the entire series. It's also interesting to see how the conversation around Bonnie has changed over the years. When Toy Story 4 came out in 2019, a huge portion of online discussion focused on blaming the character directly. A lot of people saw Bonnie as a selfish little girl who didn't understand Woody's value. But over time, more thoughtful analyses started appearing about what the movie was actually trying to say. Because Toy Story 4 isn't just about a toy being ignored. It's about the difficulty of accepting that things change, even when we don't want them to. Woody spent his entire existence defining himself through the happiness of a child. That's why it's so painful for him to accept that Bonnie doesn't need him the way she once did. And while many viewers interpreted that as an injustice toward Woody, the movie was really portraying something natural. Children don't love things the same way forever. Even in the earlier films, that idea was already there. Andy's priorities changed over time too. The difference is that we watched his relationship with Woody from the very beginning, which made their bond feel stronger and more permanent than it actually was. With Bonnie, that nostalgic attachment doesn't exist. That's why audiences judge her actions much more harshly. Bonnie also enters the franchise at a very complicated moment. She arrives right when Toy Story stops being just a story about toys and starts becoming a reflection on the passage of time. While Andy represented the classic childhood many viewers remember fondly, Bonnie represents a more modern and constantly changing version of childhood. And that ties directly into what Pixar Animation Studios seems to be exploring in Toy Story 5. The franchise is no longer just talking about the fear of being replaced by a newer toy. Now it's talking about the fear of becoming irrelevant in an entirely different generation. That's why Bonnie works so well within the story, even if much of the fandom rejects her. She isn't the real problem, she's the consequence of change. And maybe that's the real reason Bonnie ended up becoming one of Pixar's most hated characters. Not because she's evil, not because she destroyed Woody, but because she represents something a lot of people never wanted to accept. Time moved on, childhood changed, and Toy Story chose to grow up too.